Hi, I'm Megan Foster, and I never imagined my own husband could accuse me of something so shocking. He claimed I'd taken $29,000, money I had no idea even existed. I felt panic rising, unsure how to defend myself. But then I uncovered a secret hidden in plain sight, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about him, and our marriage. The accusation came on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee. David stood in our kitchen doorway, holding a bank statement I'd never seen before. His face was pale, almost gray, and his voice shook when he said the words that would change everything between us. The way he looked at me made my stomach drop. I stared at the paper in his trembling hands, trying to process what he was telling me. $29,000 missing from an account I didn't even know we had. My name was apparently on it, but I had no memory of signing anything. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in on both of us. David's eyes searched my face for answers I couldn't give him. We'd been married 8 years, and I thought I knew every detail of our financial life. We'd always been careful, transparent about money, especially after his parents' messy divorce over hidden debts. Now he was looking at me like I was a stranger who'd betrayed him. I reached for the statement with shaking hands, scanning the transactions that meant nothing to me. Withdrawals made over 3 months, all bearing my signature. The handwriting looked like mine, but I couldn't remember making a single one of these transactions. My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy standing there. The account was linked to the house David had inherited from his grandmother last year. We'd talked about using it as rental income or maybe selling it eventually, but I'd never handled any of the paperwork myself. David had taken care of everything. The house felt like such a burden to both of us back then. I told David I had no idea where the money had gone, and the hurt in his eyes cut through me. He wanted to believe me, I could see that. But the evidence seemed overwhelming. Someone had taken that money using my information, and if it wasn't me, then who could it have been? The question hung between us like a wall. That night, neither of us slept. David lay on his side of the bed, rigid and silent, while I stared at the ceiling trying to piece together fragments that didn't fit. The house, the account, my signature on papers I'd never signed. There had to be an explanation that would make sense of this mess. The next morning, I called the bank myself. The customer service representative confirmed that my signature was on file for the account, established 6 months ago. But I distinctly remembered being out of town that week, visiting my sister in Phoenix after her surgery. Someone else had signed those papers in my name. I started going through David's desk while he was at work, looking for anything that might explain the mysterious account. In a folder labeled Grandma's House, I found copies of documents I'd never seen before. My signature appeared on several pages, but something about the ink looked different from the others. It made me feel sick. There was a loan application in the folder, dated 3 weeks ago. My signature was at the bottom, along with David's, but I'd never applied for any loan. The amount requested was exactly $29,000. My hands started shaking as I read through the terms and conditions I'd supposedly agreed to. The loan was secured against the inherited house, the same property David had been managing alone since his grandmother passed. I'd trusted him to handle everything because it felt too complicated and emotional for me. Now I was wondering if that trust had been a mistake I'd pay for dearly. I confronted David that evening with the loan papers in my hands. His face went white when he saw them, and for a moment he looked like he might be sick. He sat down heavily at our kitchen table, running his hands through his hair over and over. The silence stretched between us uncomfortably. Finally, David looked up at me with tears in his eyes. He said he'd been struggling with debt from before we got married, credit cards he'd never told me about. The payments had gotten overwhelming, and he'd seen the inheritance as a way to finally get free. But he'd needed my signature to access the equity. He'd practiced writing my signature for weeks, he admitted, using old birthday cards and letters I'd written him. The bank had never questioned it because our accounts were already linked from our marriage. He'd planned to pay everything back before I found out, but the creditors had demanded more money than he'd expected. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. This man I'd loved and trusted had forged my signature, accused me of stealing, and let me believe I was losing my mind. All to cover up debts he'd hidden from me for years. The betrayal felt deeper than anything I'd ever experienced before. The house his grandmother had left him was supposed to be our fresh start, a nest egg for our future children. Instead, it had become the tool he'd used to deceive me and dig us both deeper into financial trouble. I wondered how many other secrets he'd been keeping from me. David begged for my forgiveness, promising he'd find a way to fix everything. But sitting there in our kitchen, looking at the man I'd married, I realized I didn't know him at all. The trust we'd built over 8 years had been shattered in a matter of minutes. I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. That night, I packed a small bag and went to stay at my sister's house. I needed space to think about what came next, whether our marriage could survive this level of deception. David had not only betrayed me financially, but he'd made me doubt my own sanity. That felt like the cruelest part of all. As I lay in my sister's guest room, I couldn't stop thinking about the house that had started it all. David's grandmother had worked her whole life to pay it off, probably imagining it would be a blessing for her family. Now it felt more like a curse that had revealed the worst in both of us. My sister Kate found me crying over coffee the next morning. I'd barely slept, replaying every conversation David and I had about money over the past year. She listened without judgment as I explained how my husband had forged my signature and let me believe I was going crazy. Her anger on my behalf felt strangely comforting. Kate had never fully trusted David, though she'd kept that opinion to herself during our marriage. She said something had always felt calculated about him, too smooth when discussing serious topics. Now her instincts seemed proven right, and I felt foolish for not seeing the signs she'd apparently noticed years ago. I spent the day calling lawyers, trying to understand my legal position in this mess. Most of them wanted retainer fees I couldn't afford, especially since I had no idea what other financial surprises David might have hidden from me. The house was our biggest asset, and now it was tied up in his deception. David called every few hours, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly desperate. He promised to sell the house immediately and use the money to fix everything, but I couldn't trust any promise he made now, knowing how easily lies had come to him. Each message made me feel more distant from the man I'd married. By evening, I was emotionally exhausted. Kate suggested I at least go home to get more clothes and important documents while David was at work. The thought of being in our house alone made my stomach clench. But I needed my birth certificate and passport. I wasn't sure what decisions lay ahead. Walking into our bedroom felt like entering a museum of a life I'd once lived. Everything looked the same, but it all felt false now. I wondered how many times David had practiced my signature at this very desk where I'd written thank you notes and birthday cards. The violation felt deeply personal. I found a box of financial documents David had kept locked in his closet. The key was hidden behind our wedding photo, which struck me as particularly cruel. Inside were credit card statements going back 5 years, showing a pattern of debt I'd never suspected. The minimum payments alone were staggering. The statements revealed expensive purchases I'd never seen: tools, electronics, trips with friends while I was working late shifts at the hospital. David had been living a completely separate financial life, funded by credit cards and lies. I felt like I'd been married to a stranger. There was also correspondence with a debt consolidation company discussing bankruptcy as an option. David had been closer to financial ruin than I'd imagined, which explained his desperation about the house money. But understanding his motivation didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. It actually made it worse somehow. I called the bank managing his grandmother's estate and explained the situation. The customer service representative was sympathetic but firm. The loan was legally binding regardless of how my signature had been obtained. We were both liable for the debt now, whether I'd known about it or not. My phone buzzed with another call from David. This time I answered, and his relief at hearing my voice was palpable. He said he'd been sitting in the parking lot of his grandmother's house, trying to figure out how to undo the damage he'd caused. The house where this all started. David asked if I would meet him there, so we could talk without the emotional weight of our home surrounding us. Part of me wanted to refuse, but I knew we had to face this situation together eventually. The house felt like neutral ground, even though it was the source of our problems. I drove there as the sun was setting, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The small blue cottage looked peaceful in the golden light, with its well-tended garden and white picket fence. It was hard to believe something so charming had become the center of our crisis. David was sitting on the front porch steps when I arrived, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His shoulders were slumped, and he didn't look up when I parked. Walking toward him felt like approaching a wounded animal that might bolt or lash out unexpectedly. We sat in silence for several minutes, both staring at the garden his grandmother had loved. Finally, David spoke about the pressure he'd felt to be a perfect provider, the shame of his debt that had grown too large to confess. His words sounded sincere, but I wasn't sure I could trust my judgment anymore. I told him about the legal advice I'd received, how the forged signature might be prosecuted as fraud if I chose to report it. David's face went pale, and I realized he hadn't fully considered the criminal implications of what he'd done. The weight of that possibility settled between us. The house felt different now that I understood its role in our story. His grandmother had probably imagined it would bring joy to her family, not tear a marriage apart. I wondered what she would think of how her final gift had been used by her grandson. David suggested we sell the house immediately and use whatever equity remained to start over somewhere else. But the loan had eaten into most of its value, and we'd barely break even after paying the debt consolidation company. Starting over would mean starting with nothing, assuming I even wanted to try. As darkness fell, we went inside the empty house. It still smelled faintly of his grandmother's lavender sachets, a scent that had always comforted me. Now it felt like a reminder of trust and family bonds that we'd somehow broken beyond repair. Standing in the living room where family photos still hung on the walls, I realized this house represented more than money to David. It was his connection to a grandmother who'd believed in him, and he'd corrupted that legacy with his deception. That seemed like its own kind of punishment. I asked David if he'd planned to tell me about the debt eventually, or if he'd hoped to hide it forever. He said he'd convinced himself he could fix everything before I found out, that I'd never have to carry the burden of his mistakes. His good intentions felt meaningless now. We talked until nearly midnight, covering the same emotional ground repeatedly without reaching any resolution. David wanted forgiveness I wasn't ready to give, and I wanted trust that might never be fully restored. The house held our words, but offered no wisdom. Driving home separately felt symbolic of how far apart we'd grown in just a few days. I went back to Kate's house, while David returned to our empty bedroom. The physical distance between us seemed to mirror the emotional chasm that had opened. That night, lying in Kate's guest bed again, I realized that David's betrayal had changed something fundamental in me. I'd always believed people were essentially good, that love could overcome most obstacles. Now, I wasn't sure what I believed about anything. The worst part wasn't even the money or the forged signature. It was the realization that David had watched me panic and question my own sanity, then chosen to let me suffer rather than admit his deception. That cruelty felt unforgivable in ways that surprised me. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if other wives had discovered similar betrayals, whether the man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years had the capacity for redemption, or if some bridges simply couldn't be rebuilt once they'd been burned. The house would be sold eventually, but I wasn't sure our marriage would survive long enough to see that resolution. Trust, once broken so completely, might be harder to repair than any financial damage David had caused us both. The next few days passed in a strange blur of phone calls and paperwork. I met with a lawyer Kate had recommended, a kind woman who specialized in financial fraud between spouses. She explained that my options were limited but real. I could press charges for forgery, file for divorce, or try to work things out privately. Each option felt impossible in its own way. Pressing charges would destroy David's career as an accountant, making it even harder for us to pay back the debt. Divorce would mean dividing assets we didn't really have. Working things out required a level of trust I wasn't sure I could rebuild. David had moved into the guest bedroom without me asking him to. When I finally came home to get more clothes, I found him sleeping on the narrow single bed, looking uncomfortable and defeated. Part of me felt sorry for him, which made me angry at myself for still caring. He'd printed out a detailed plan for repaying every penny of the debt, complete with timeline and budget projections. The optimism of it struck me as naive. We'd be eating rice and beans for 3 years if we followed his calculations exactly, but at least he was facing the reality now. I started having panic attacks at work, triggered by the simplest financial conversations with patients about their insurance. My hands would shake when signing my own name on charts, hyper-aware of how easily signatures could be forged. The trauma was affecting every aspect of my life now. Kate suggested I see a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma. I resisted at first, thinking therapy was for people with bigger problems than mine. But when I found myself crying in the hospital bathroom for the 3rd time that week, I finally made an appointment. Dr. Chen was surprisingly young and direct, nothing like the gentle, nodding therapist I'd expected. She asked pointed questions about red flags I might have missed, patterns of deception that could have started small. Her approach forced me to examine my marriage with uncomfortable honesty. I realized David had always controlled our finances more than I'd thought. He'd insisted on managing the bills, saying I worked too many hours to worry about mundane money matters. Now I wondered if he'd been hiding smaller deceptions all along, building up to this massive betrayal. There had been times when credit card statements didn't arrive, or when David claimed the bank had made errors that took weeks to resolve. I'd trusted his explanations because questioning them felt petty and suspicious. Now those memories felt like evidence I'd chosen to ignore. Dr. Chen asked if I'd ever checked our credit reports, and I admitted I'd left that entirely to David. She suggested I pull them immediately, warning that I might find other surprises. The thought of more hidden debt made my chest tight with anxiety. The credit reports arrived by email that evening, and they were worse than I'd imagined. Cards I'd never applied for, loans I'd never signed for, all bearing my name and social security number. David had been using my identity for years, not just months. My credit score had been tanking while I remained blissfully unaware, trusting the man I'd married to protect our financial future. Instead, he'd been systematically destroying it while I worked extra shifts to save for the house down payment we'd never actually need. I confronted David with the credit report spread across our kitchen table like evidence in a crime scene. His face crumpled when he saw them, and he admitted the debt was even worse than he'd initially confessed. The house loan was just the most recent attempt to stay afloat. $29,000 was nothing compared to the total damage. We were looking at nearly $70,000 in combined debt, most of it accrued in my name without my knowledge. The number felt so large it became almost abstract, like discussing the national deficit. David broke down completely then, sobbing about his father's gambling addiction and the shame he'd carried about money since childhood. He'd been terrified of becoming like his dad, but in trying to hide from that legacy, he'd created an even worse situation for both of us. His tears felt genuine, but I'd lost the ability to distinguish between David's authentic emotions and his manipulation. Maybe they were the same thing now. Maybe his guilt was real, but that didn't undo the damage he'd caused to both our lives. I asked him to leave the house for a week while I decided what to do next. He packed a bag quietly, leaving his key on the kitchen counter. The sound of his car pulling away felt both relieving and terrifying. I was alone with a financial disaster I'd never chosen. The silence in our house was different now, heavy with the weight of broken promises and shattered trust. I walked through rooms that held 8 years of memories, wondering which moments had been real and which had been built on lies I couldn't recognize. I called the bank to remove my name from the house account, but they explained I'd need David's signature since we were both listed as borrowers. Even leaving required his cooperation, which gave him power over me that felt deeply unfair after everything he'd done. Kate came over that evening with Chinese takeout and wine, sitting with me while I tried to process the magnitude of our financial ruin. She didn't offer advice, just listened while I talked through scenarios that all seemed impossible. Sometimes presence mattered more than solutions. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from David, but I wasn't ready to hear more apologies or promises. I needed space to think without his desperate energy clouding my judgment. Each ignored call felt like a small step toward reclaiming my own voice. That night, I dreamed about his grandmother's house. But in the dream, it was falling apart. Windows broken and paint peeling. I was trying to fix it with my bare hands while water poured through the roof. I woke up feeling exhausted, as if I'd actually been working all night. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The house that was supposed to represent security and inheritance had become a crumbling burden we couldn't maintain. Sometimes our subconscious understands things our waking minds resist accepting. The dream felt like a warning I should heed. I spent the weekend researching bankruptcy lawyers and divorce attorneys, printing out forms I hoped I'd never need to file. Having options felt empowering, even if they were all painful choices. At least I was making decisions based on reality now, not trust. Monday morning brought a surprise visit from David's mother, Linda, who'd driven 3 hours to see me. She'd heard about our troubles through David's desperate phone calls and wanted to apologize for her son's behavior. Her concern felt genuine, which somehow made everything worse. Linda had suspected David was struggling financially, but hadn't known the extent of his deception. She offered to help with the debt using her retirement savings, an act of generosity that brought me to tears. But taking money from his mother felt wrong, another layer of damage. We sat in my living room drinking coffee while Linda shared stories about David's childhood anxiety around money. She painted a picture of a boy who'd hidden his allowance and counted it obsessively, terrified of ever being without resources. Understanding didn't excuse his choices, but it made them more human. Linda asked if I thought their marriage could be saved, and I admitted I didn't know anymore. Trust had been the foundation of everything we'd built together, and now that foundation was completely gone. Starting over might require more courage than I possessed. After Linda left, I sat in my empty house surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion. The walls held memories of happiness that now felt contaminated by everything I'd learned. Even good moments carried the sting of wondering what else I hadn't known. That evening, I finally answered one of David's calls. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been crying or not sleeping. He asked if there was any chance we could work through this together, if love could be stronger than the damage he'd caused. I told him I needed more time, that healing would require years, not weeks, if it was even possible at all. Some betrayals cut so deep they changed the fundamental structure of a relationship. We might never be the same people who'd made promises 8 years ago. David said he understood and would wait as long as necessary for me to decide our future. But I could hear the desperation in his voice, the fear that waiting might mean losing me forever. That fear was probably justified, though I wasn't ready to say so yet. Hanging up the phone, I realized I was grieving not just our marriage but the version of myself who'd trusted so completely. That woman felt naive now, almost foolish in her faith that love could protect her from deception. I wasn't sure who I'd become without that innocence. The house his grandmother had left us was still sitting empty, a monument to good intentions gone wrong. Soon we'd have to decide whether to sell it or let the bank foreclose, adding another failure to our growing list. Either way, that legacy was tainted forever. I understood now why some couples never recovered from financial betrayal. Money represented so much more than numbers. It was about security, respect, partnership, and shared values. David hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen my ability to feel safe in our life together. 2 weeks after Linda's visit, I finally drove to the grandmother's house alone. I'd been avoiding it, but something inside me needed to see the place that had started our destruction. The cottage looked peaceful in the afternoon light, betraying nothing of the chaos it had caused in our lives. I used the spare key Linda had given me and walked through rooms that still smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing 3 generations of David's family gathered around holiday tables. The happiness in those images felt like a rebuke to our current situation. In the bedroom, I found boxes of David's grandmother's belongings that he'd never sorted through. Letters tied with ribbons, recipe cards written in careful script, a jewelry box containing a wedding ring worn smooth by decades of marriage. She'd lived here for 47 years with the same man. Her diary was tucked beneath a pile of quilts, its leather cover soft with age. I hesitated before opening it, knowing I was invading her privacy. But I needed to understand what this house had meant to her, why she'd thought it would be a blessing for David. The entries revealed a woman who'd struggled financially in her early marriage, but had built something solid through patience and sacrifice. She wrote about pinching pennies to pay the mortgage, about arguments with her husband over money that had eventually strengthened their partnership. Her persistence had created this sanctuary. Reading her words made David's choices feel even more devastating. She'd left him this house as a symbol of what commitment could accomplish over time. Instead, he'd used it to hide from the very values she'd tried to pass down to him. I found myself crying in her kitchen, surrounded by the ceramic roosters she'd collected and the hand-crocheted dishcloths she'd made. This woman had built a life of simple contentment, and David had turned her final gift into something shameful. The waste of it overwhelmed me. My phone rang while I sat at her kitchen table, and this time it was Dr. Chen. She'd had a cancellation and wondered if I wanted to move up my appointment. Something about being in this house made me desperate for guidance, so I agreed to meet her immediately. Dr. Chen's office felt sterile after the warmth of the grandmother's house, but her direct questions helped me focus. She asked what I'd learned about myself during these weeks of crisis, whether I'd discovered any strength I hadn't known I possessed. The question surprised me. I realized I'd been making decisions independently for the first time in our marriage. Choosing lawyers, managing bank calls, setting boundaries with David, all things I'd previously deferred to him. The crisis had forced me to find capabilities I'd forgotten I had. But Dr. Chen pushed deeper, asking whether I'd been avoiding difficult decisions by staying in this liminal space of separation. Was I punishing David indefinitely? Or was I genuinely trying to decide our future? Her challenge made me uncomfortable because it held truth. I admitted I'd been paralyzed between fear of staying and fear of leaving. Staying meant accepting that David could betray me again, that I might never feel truly safe in our marriage. Leaving meant starting over at 35 with damaged credit and emotional wounds I wasn't sure would heal. Dr. Chen suggested I write a letter to David outlining exactly what rebuilding trust would require from him. Not a reconciliation letter, but a blueprint for what redemption might look like if I chose to attempt it. The exercise would clarify my own needs. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to articulate what David would need to do to earn forgiveness. Complete financial transparency seemed obvious, but I realized I needed much more. I wanted proof that he could be honest when it was difficult. The list grew longer than I'd expected. Individual therapy for him, couples counseling for us, complete access to all accounts and credit reports, a structured repayment plan, and regular check-ins about our financial situation. Reading it back, the requirements felt overwhelming and possibly impossible. But writing them down helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't something I could simply decide to give. It would have to be earned through consistent actions over time, probably years. David would need to prove he could be the partner I'd thought I'd married. I called David that night and read him the list over the phone. His silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, but he agreed to every requirement without negotiation. His immediate acceptance actually worried me more than resistance would have. Was he truly committed to change, or was he just desperate to avoid losing our marriage? I'd learned that David's words couldn't be trusted, so only his actions over time would tell me what I needed to know. David asked if I would consider meeting with a mediator to discuss selling his grandmother's house and managing our debt together. He'd found someone who specialized in helping couples navigate financial crises without immediately divorcing. The suggestion felt like progress, however small. I agreed to one session, though I warned him it didn't mean I'd decided to stay in our marriage. We were simply two people who shared a massive debt and needed to handle it responsibly. Whatever emotional future we might have remained completely separate from these practical decisions. The mediator's office was neutral territory, decorated in soothing beiges that probably helped stressed couples feel calmer. David looked nervous when I arrived, fidgeting with papers and avoiding eye contact. He'd clearly prepared extensively for this meeting, which felt both hopeful and calculating. Our mediator, Carol, was a retired family court judge with gray hair and kind eyes that had probably seen worse situations than ours. She began by acknowledging that financial betrayal was a form of emotional abuse, which validated feelings I'd been afraid to name. Carol helped us create a concrete plan for selling the house and dividing responsibility for the debt repayment. Seeing everything laid out in spreadsheets made the situation feel more manageable, though still overwhelming. Numbers were easier to face than emotions. David surprised me by suggesting we split the debt equally, even though most of it had been his responsibility originally. He wanted to take ownership of the damage he'd caused rather than hiding behind legal technicalities. The gesture felt significant, though I wasn't ready to interpret it as redemption. We scheduled 3 more sessions to finalize the details, with the understanding that resolving our financial crisis didn't require resolving our marriage. I could work with David as a business partner while still deciding whether I wanted him as a husband. Driving home separately after the session, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. A sense of forward motion. We were finally taking concrete steps to clean up the mess, regardless of what happened between us personally. Progress felt possible again. That night, I called Kate to update her on the mediation session. She'd been worried I was getting sucked back into David's manipulation, but she admitted the structured approach sounded healthier than the emotional chaos we'd been living in. Kate asked if I missed David, and I realized the answer was complicated. I missed the man I'd thought he was, but I wasn't sure that person had ever really existed. Learning to separate my grief for our marriage from any hope for our future felt like necessary emotional work. I'd been sleeping better since establishing clear boundaries with David. The constant anxiety of wondering what he might be hiding had lifted somewhat, replaced by a different kind of uncertainty. At least now I was making choices based on reality rather than illusion. The grandmother's house was officially going on the market next week, and I felt sad about losing that connection to David's family history. His grandmother had probably imagined the house staying in the family for another generation. Our crisis had ended that possibility forever, but maybe some legacies are meant to be transformed rather than preserved exactly as they were. The grandmother's real gift hadn't been the house itself, but the example of building something solid through honest work and commitment. That lesson could survive even if the house didn't. I was learning to separate David's choices from his grandmother's intentions. She'd given him a foundation for financial security, and he'd chosen to undermine it with deception. His failure didn't diminish her wisdom or love. It only revealed his inability to receive them properly. Lying in bed that night, I felt something approaching peace for the first time in months. I still didn't know whether my marriage could be saved, but I'd stopped feeling desperate for immediate answers. Some decisions required patience and observation rather than rushed conclusions. The next morning brought a text from David thanking me for agreeing to work together on resolving our financial situation. His gratitude felt appropriate rather than manipulative, which seemed like a small but important distinction. Maybe he was finally understanding the gravity of what he'd destroyed. I responded with simple acknowledgement, avoiding the emotional language we'd used throughout our marriage. Building new patterns of communication felt necessary, whether we ended up together or apart. Either way, I needed to know I could trust my own judgment again. 6 months later, I was signing the final paperwork to sell his grandmother's house. My signature looked different now, more deliberate, as if I'd learned to pay attention to what I was putting my name on. The buyer was a young couple with a baby, and I hoped they'd fill those rooms with the happiness they deserved. David sat beside me at the closing table, subdued and respectful of the space I'd maintained between us. He'd followed through on everything we'd agreed to in mediation: therapy sessions, complete financial disclosure, a structured repayment plan that would take us 4 years to complete if we stuck to it religiously. The house sold for less than we'd hoped, but enough to pay off the immediate loan and make a dent in our other debts. Watching David hand over the keys to someone else felt like witnessing the end of his family's connection to that place. His grandmother's legacy would live on with strangers now. Our individual therapy sessions had revealed things about both of us that surprised me. David's financial anxiety ran deeper than I'd understood, rooted in childhood trauma from his father's gambling addiction. But understanding his wounds didn't automatically heal the ones he'd inflicted on me through his choices. Dr. Chen had helped me understand that I'd given away too much power in our marriage, deferring to David's judgment, even in areas where I had equal expertise. The betrayal had forced me to reclaim responsibility for my own financial future, which felt empowering despite the painful circumstances. We'd been living separately for 8 months now, meeting weekly with our couple's therapist to work through the layers of trust that needed rebuilding. Some sessions left me hopeful. Others reminded me how fundamentally damaged our foundation had become. Progress felt glacially slow but genuine. David had been completely transparent about money since the crisis began, sharing every bank statement and credit card bill with me. He'd taken a second job delivering food on weekends, throwing every extra dollar toward our debt. His commitment to making amends seemed real, but I still questioned whether it would last. The legal implications of the forged signatures had been resolved through our mediation agreement rather than criminal charges. I'd chosen accountability over punishment, though some days I wondered if I'd been too forgiving. Trust required verification now, not just faith in his promises. My credit score was slowly improving as we paid down the debt systematically. Rebuilding financial stability felt like a metaphor for everything else we were trying to repair. Some damage could be fixed with time and effort. Other damage might be permanent. Kate had been my anchor throughout this process, listening to my doubts and fears without pushing me toward any particular decision. She'd seen me grow stronger during the crisis, more sure of my own judgment and boundaries. Sometimes the worst experiences teach us the most about ourselves. I'd been promoted to charge nurse at the hospital, partly because the crisis had taught me to speak up for myself more assertively. The skills I'd learned advocating for my own interests had transferred to advocating for my patients and staff. Personal growth often came from unexpected directions. David and I had started having dinner together once a week, neutral meetings where we discussed practical matters and slowly tried to remember how to be friends. The romantic connection we'd shared felt fragile and uncertain, but basic respect was beginning to return between us. He'd written me letters apologizing for specific moments during the crisis when he'd let me suffer rather than confessing his deception. Reading about his thought process during those dark weeks helped me understand how fear had twisted his judgment into something cruel and selfish. The couples therapist had warned us that rebuilding after financial betrayal often took longer than people expected. Trust was rebuilt through thousands of small interactions over time, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The work was tedious, but necessary. I'd started dating someone else briefly, a doctor from another department who knew nothing about my situation with David. The experience taught me that my capacity for trust hadn't been completely destroyed, which felt like an important discovery. But I'd ended it after realizing I wasn't ready. Our divorce papers were still filed but not finalized, sitting in legal limbo while we decided whether reconciliation was possible. The deadline for finalizing them was approaching, forcing us to make a decision we'd been avoiding. Time was running out for hesitation. David had asked if I would consider moving back home on a trial basis, not as husband and wife, but as roommates working toward a common goal. The practical benefits were obvious: shared expenses, easier debt management, and a chance to see if daily life together was still tolerable. I'd been considering his proposal for weeks, weighing the financial advantages against the emotional risks. Moving back felt like either a step toward healing or a step backward into patterns that had enabled his deception originally. The distinction felt crucial, but unclear. The night before I needed to give David my answer, I drove to where his grandmother's house had stood. The new owners had planted flowers in the front yard and hung wind chimes on the porch. Life was continuing in that space, unmarked by our crisis. Standing on the sidewalk where I'd confronted David about his lies, I realized something had shifted inside me during these months of separation. I'd learned to trust my own judgment again, to set boundaries and enforce them, to to build a life that didn't depend entirely on someone else's choices. That strength didn't necessarily mean I should leave David, but it meant I could choose to stay from a position of power rather than vulnerability. If we rebuilt our marriage, it would be because I wanted to, not because I needed to or feared being alone. I called David that evening and told him I was willing to try living together again, with conditions. Separate bedrooms initially, continued therapy, complete financial transparency, and the understanding that I could leave again if I felt he was slipping back into old patterns. His relief was palpable, but so was his understanding that this wasn't a return to our old marriage. We were two different people now, shaped by crisis and growth. Whatever we built together would need to be entirely new, not a restoration of what we'd lost. Moving back into our house felt strange after months of independence. David had painted the guest bedroom for me and installed new locks on our filing cabinet, small gestures that acknowledged my need for security. Trust would come through actions, not words. Our first few weeks as roommates were awkward but manageable. We developed new routines that gave us both space while sharing the practical burdens of bill paying and debt management. The romantic relationship we'd once shared felt like something that might return someday, or might not. I kept my own bank account and maintained financial independence even while we worked together toward our common goal of debt elimination. The crisis had taught me never to surrender complete control over my financial future again. Some lessons were too valuable to forget. David seemed to understand that he was earning his way back into my life, rather than resuming a position he'd never truly lost. His humility felt genuine, though I remained watchful for signs of his old patterns reasserting themselves. Forgiveness was a process, not a decision. 3 months into our trial reunion, David suggested we renew our wedding vows once we'd paid off the last of our debt. The idea felt premature to me, but I appreciated that he understood our marriage needed to be consciously rebuilt rather than simply resumed. Our couples therapist had warned us that some relationships don't survive the rebuilding process, that discovering what trust really requires can reveal fundamental incompatibilities. We were both willing to risk that possibility in order to find out what was genuinely salvageable between us. The debt would be fully paid off in 18 more months if we maintained our current pace. That milestone felt more significant to me than any anniversary we'd celebrated during our original marriage. It would represent something we'd accomplished together in full honesty. I'd learned that forgiveness wasn't something I owed David, but something I could choose to offer if he earned it through consistent action over time. The power to forgive remained mine, which felt like a form of protection I'd never understood before. Some days I felt hopeful about our future together. Other days I felt like we were just two people who happened to share a debt and a history. Both feelings seemed valid, and I'd stopped trying to force clarity that might come naturally with more time. The grandmother's legacy lived on in ways that had nothing to do with the house she'd left behind. Her example of building something solid through honest work had become my template for whatever David and I might create together. Foundation first, everything else second. Looking back, I could see that the crisis had revealed weaknesses in our marriage that might have destroyed us eventually anyway. David's financial deception had been a symptom of deeper issues with communication, trust, and partnership that we'd never addressed properly. I was grateful now for the wake-up call, even though it had been devastating to receive. Better to face these problems at 35 than at 55, with more years and possibly children involved. Some gifts come disguised as disasters. Whatever happened between David and me, I'd learned that I could survive betrayal and rebuild my life from the ground up. That knowledge felt more valuable than any house or inheritance. No one could forge my signature on that kind of strength.